Hey people, John here from Fast Films, and today we're going through a 1997 thriller, horror movie called The Devil's Advocate. The movie begins with a girl named Barbara giving testimony against a man named Mr. Getty who had physically abused her. Mr. Getty's defendant is Mr. Kevin Lomax. Kevin is confused as he watches Mr. Getty pleases himself under the table. When it is Kevin's turn, he asks the judge for recess. Outside, Kevin speaks angrily to Getty, realizing he had been fooled by Getty. In the next scene, Kevin goes to clear his head in the men's room. Larry comes to tease him that his string of victories will come to an end. Kevin goes back into court. In the courtroom, Kevin questions Barbara and annuls her testimony by showing that she made up the story because she didn't like Mr. Getty. The judge adjourns the case. Kevin's wife named Mary Ann takes Kevin to go celebrate. After that, the lawyers celebrate over drinks. Larry asks a sly question about the case, but Mary tells Larry to stop. In the next scene, they are seen dancing at a party, and Kevin and Mary are seen kissing. Kevin goes to take a leak, and a man named Heath comes to offer Kevin a job in New York to help pick a jury with a payment that leaves him speechless. The next scene happens in a church, where Kevin comes to see his mum, Alice, about his job in New York. His mum thinks New York is like Babylon and is demon-filled. Eventually, his mother wishes him luck. Later on, Kevin goes to meet his wife, so they don't miss their flight. In New York, Kevin watches as his colleague questions the prospective jurors. Kevin calls him and suggests his choice of jurors, which is not his choice. He tells Heath to fire Kevin or he leaves, and Heath asks him to leave. Eventually, he sticks with Kevin's suggestions. Later, outside the court, a man named John Milton watches Kevin. In the next scene, Kevin gets home, and Mary notices he looks worried. She asks him why he's worried, and he pretends like he lost the case, just to tell her his jury found his man not guilty in just 38 minutes. Later on, Heath shows Kevin around the company named Milton, Chadwick, and Waters. Kevin spots a lady named Christabella who interests him. Eventually, Kevin walks into an odd large room on his own, and behind him is Mr. John Milton. Milton mentions his astonishment at his track record of 64 straight convictions. Milton asks about his father, but he tells him he doesn't know his father. In the next scene, Heath takes Kevin and Mary to their apartment, which they really love. Mary is surprised at the size of the apartment, but Kevin tells her he'll leave it if she isn't on board, and she sarcastically suggests they go back and suffer in Florida, and expresses her joy. Next, they are seen making out. After that, Kevin is introduced to the rest of the leaders at the company. In the next scene, Heath shows Kevin his office. A lady named Pam comes to give Kevin an overview of the Moyes case as per Milton's request. Later on, Pam shows Kevin a video of Moyes doing an animal ritual and getting arrested. In the next scene, Mary does some shopping for some home decorations, and Kevin goes to meet her. Kevin goes to a scrappy apartment and asks to meet Philip Moyes, and a young kid takes him to a dark basement that has a lot of candles, which creeps Kevin out. He runs into Moyes, who asks Kevin the name of their prosecutor, and Kevin tells him it's Merdo. Mr. Moyes proceeds to do a ritual against Merdo, so he can't speak in court. At the office, Kevin works late on the case. After that, Mary is seen painting the house with Jackie, who does not approve of the color. Later at night, Pam reminds Kevin it's just a health code case and greets him good night. Mary Ann still struggles to pick a design and angrily rips off the papers. Later at night, Mary speaks to Jackie about how it sucks to be jobless. Jackie painfully tells her that she has to make an appointment to see her husband. In court, the next day, Kevin slams meat on the court table to prove that people kill animals too, and requests for dismissal. Meanwhile, Mr. Merdo starts to cough profusely and cannot speak. Outside, Milton congratulates Kevin on winning the case. Later on, Milton and Kevin take a walk. Milton advises him that he is too visible, and should let people underestimate him. Later, when Kevin gets home, Mary tells him they're late for their party. She makes him promise her to be there throughout. Afterward, Mary is seen nervous about the event. In the hall later, Kevin meets Eddie Barzoon and his wife, Diana. Eddie introduces Kevin around. Later, Heath comes to take Kevin away to meet someone and leaves Mary Ann. Christabella spots Kevin and seems intrigued by the sight. At the party, Mary is curious as to who Milton is, and later they meet. Later, Mary speaks with Milton. Milton asks her how she has been coping without her family, and she shares her daddy's issues, which he relates with. Kevin spots Christabella and is also intrigued. Milton speaks to Mary about her hair and advises that he thinks it looks better if she pulls it back, and teases her to pull it back there, which she does. Later, Kevin still stares at Christabella. Meanwhile, Milton advises Mary to cut her hair while he looks at her, and he also compliments her eyes, which amuses her. On the roof, Kevin goes out to join Christabella, and they talk. At the party, Mary looks for Kevin. On the terrace, Christabella and Kevin flirt. Immediately, Milton comes to join them, and he notices Milton's hand slide across her gown. Milton tells him something has come up and asks him to come with Heath and Eddie to his place. At the party, Mary still looks for Kevin. Later, Kevin, Eddie, and Heath go meet Milton. Milton tells them a client, Alex Cullen, has been charged with the murder of his wife, stepson, and maid. Eddie wants the case, but Milton says he wants Kevin, which Eddie thinks is a bad idea. Milton asks Kevin to convince the client. Later at home, Mary seems annoyed Kevin bailed on her while drowning her anger in booze. Kevin tries to reason with her, but she is pissed off. The next morning, Alex is freaked out that Kevin is Milton's choice. Kevin eventually convinces Alex. Alex claims he called the cop when he saw his family murdered and he only cares about his daughter now. Alex asks Kevin to come to see him later. Meanwhile, Jackie, Diana, and Mary go shopping. Also, Mary has cut her hair. In the ladies' dressing room, Mary notices Jackie's face turn into that of an awful monster, which makes her run out. Back at home, Mary screams hysterically and tells Kevin she doesn't like it here as she narrates her experience. Kevin thinks it was the wine, but Mary disagrees. Mary speaks about how she doesn't see him anymore, and how she gets so lonely. Kevin feels bad and he proposes that they have a child. They both start to make out, but instead, he keeps seeing an image of Christabella, and later, Mary asks him to stop since he is distracted. Kevin requests for Alex to explain in detail what happened. He asks about how he picked up the gun, and Alex shows him his gun. Kevin and Pam proceed to go speak to Melissa, Alex's assistant. Later on, Kevin goes to pick up his mother with Mary. They step into the building and run into Milton, Christabella, and a lady named Gazelle. Milton introduces himself, but Alice seems distressed about him. Milton introduces Christabella and Gazelle to Mary. In the elevator, Milton asks Alice about her visit, but she seems worried. Mary glares at Kevin for locking eyes with Christabella and Gazelle. Afterward, Milton invites Kevin to his room, while Christabella makes out with Gazelle, but he refuses because of Mary. Once inside, Mary confronts him about what happened in the elevator with Christabella. The next morning, Kevin sees shocking news on the paper about Alex. His mom says she's going home because she doesn't feel right, but he asks her to stay. Alice suggests she takes Mary home as Kevin doesn't have time, which annoys him. Kevin considers the case at the office. He speaks to Alex's assistant. Kevin notices Eddie shredding a lot of documents with some men. Eddie tells him to say he never saw this if anyone asks, especially the Weaver Commission. Later on, Milton takes Kevin out. On the train, Kevin asks Milton about the Weaver Commission. A man gets enraged by Milton staring at him and threatens Milton, but oddly, Milton tells him about how his wife is planning on cheating on him with his friend at the moment. The man is shocked and hurries home. Kevin and Milton watch the fight. Outside, Kevin calls Mary and they argue on the phone. Later, Kevin goes to meet Milton, who sits with a lot of women. In the apartment, Mary wakes up and hears creepy noises. She holds a knife and later finds a baby in her house, and tries to comfort the child, but she sees a bloody scene. Later, in the morning, Mary tells Kevin what happened. He believes she was dreaming, but Mary acts strange, and Kevin tries to calm her down. Kevin goes to meet Alex about how his wife suspected he was cheating, and he has a motive of having killed her so she doesn't get his money. Alex confesses he was cheating with his assistant. Kevin speaks with the doctor about Mary. Milton tells him to drop the case and go stay with his wife, but Kevin insists, and Milton caves. In the next scene, after the prosecutor speaks, Kevin tells the jury he doesn't think Alex is a likable man too, but that isn't a reason to charge him for murder. After that, Alex challenges Kevin about speaking badly about him, but Kevin shows him he did it to prove he's innocent. Outside, Eddie comes to confront Kevin about his new partnership in the company, but Kevin knows nothing about it. Eddie threatens to speak to Weaver. Kevin goes to speak with Milton about Eddie. Milton speaks about the greed of humans on the planet. Meanwhile, Eddie gets attacked by some homeless people, while Mary watches and sees the homeless people change into demonic faces until they eliminate Eddie. In the next scene, Kevin interrogates Melissa about her cheating to help her prepare. He asks her if Alex is circumcised, but she doesn't know. This enrages Kevin because she may be lying. Kevin goes outside and hears about Eddie. Kevin speaks with Milton and is enraged that Melissa and Alex are lying to him. Later, in court, Kevin appears reluctant, but later calls Melissa. Later, they come out, and Alex congratulates Kevin for winning the case. At home, Kevin is told by a guard at his house that his wife isn't well and has gone to a church. Kevin runs there and finds Mary, who tells him Milton made love to her. She tells him it happened in the afternoon, but Kevin tells her Milton was in court. She strips herself and shows a lot of cut marks. In the next scene, Kevin takes Mary to a psych ward. The next day, at Eddie's funeral, Kevin spots Alex and he feels guilty. Christabella comes to sit with him, which makes Jackie smile. Kevin notices Alex inappropriately touching his daughter and he walks out of the church. Outside the church, Mitch Weaver tries to question Kevin, but he avoids him. Back in the church, Milton looks worried about something. Weaver tries to convince Kevin that Milton's company is into a lot of illegal things. Meanwhile, at the church, Milton is seen playing with holy water. Weaver tells him more about Milton, but Kevin ignores him. Weaver tells him Getty, who he helped, had killed a minor. We move to a scene at the church. The holy water Milton puts his hands in starts to boil. Outside, Weaver gets hit by a car. Meanwhile, Milton looks satisfied at the church. At the psychiatric home, Kevin meets his mother with his wife. Kevin notices Mary is getting worse and cries, and Alice takes him outside. Outside, Alice tells him that she met his father as a waiter in New York, which enrages him. Pam shows Mary a mirror, but Mary sees Pam's face turn demonic and pushes her out and locks herself in, and gets hold of mirror shards. Kevin tries to open the door, but can't. He asks Pam to get help but she doesn't. Kevin tries to break the door, but Mary kills herself before he gets in. Outside, Kevin tells his mom to finish her story, and she tells him the waiter she made out with is Milton. Kevin goes to meet Milton, but his mom tries to stop him. Outside, Pam tells him Milton will take away his fear and she disappears. At Milton's apartment, Kevin points a gun at him and asks him what he did to Mary, and he tells him he made out with her, and Kevin attacks him but he doesn't die. Kevin realizes Milton as Satan. Kevin decides to leave, but Milton shows him he never forced him to do all he has done, and all he has done with his cases are his choice. Milton tells him Christabella is his half-sister. Milton tells him to set aside his guilt, but he refuses. Milton tells him not to carry his guilt for God because God just set up humanity for amusement. Milton tells him he wants Kevin and Christabella to take over the firm and have a child together which Kevin calls the Antichrist. Kevin tells him he loses in the Bible, and he says that's not true. Christabella tells them to stop talking as Kevin goes to make out with her, but meanwhile, Kevin stops and eliminates himself which annoys Milton who destroys everything. Immediately, Kevin returns to the men's room in Getty's case with Larry. Kevin steps out and spots Mary, and goes to kiss her. Kevin tells the judge he cannot represent Mr. Getty anymore. In the final scene, outside the court, Larry asks him for an exclusive story of what happened and he agrees. Later, Larry physically changes into Milton. Thanks for watching, guys.